Webster defines crunch time as a critical moment or period, like the end of a game, when decisive action is needed. Every sports fan knows this time in the game. Your palms sweat just a little more, your heart races just a little bit faster, and you live and die with every play until the final seconds tick off the clock and you're either celebrating a victory or disappointed by the defeat. The team at Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network understands just how critical these moments are. For us, it begins as soon as the next set of games are on the board. We evaluate the opening lines and any breaking news throughout the week. We cover each game inside and out, whether it's from inside the locker room to a huddle down on the field, the court, or the ice. We take you inside the meeting room with scouts, coaches, and executives. We have our fingers on the pulse of all the sports that we cover: the National Hockey League, NBA, college basketball, college football, and the National Football League. We are the Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network, and we're here to help you find your sports advantage. After all the data has been crunched, we then turn it over to Kenneth for the best analysis around. His unique perspective in both understanding the data and how it applies to the game and how you win is the Crunch Time Sports Advantage. Are you ready? The Crunch Time Jet is fueled and ready for takeoff, and the Crunch Time Express is about to leave the station. Your VIP pass has been approved, so all aboard.
Good evening, everyone. This is Jessica, and I will be joined momentarily by our senior analyst, Kenneth. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform and on YouTube. You can also follow us on Twitter at CrunchTimeVIP. Welcome to the Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network's Top 25 rankings, where we take a different approach to evaluating the best teams in college football. Unlike traditional polls, our rankings are fluid and adapt each week based on the most current data. We assess every key aspect of a team's performance, going beyond just wins and losses. We start by looking at power rankings and strength of schedule, not just for the games already played, but also for the tough matchups looming ahead. Then, we break down each team across all three phases of the game: offense, defense, and special teams. For special teams, we dig deep into the kicking game, analyzing field goals, punting, and even the impact of kickoff and punt returns. These often overlooked plays can change the course of a game, and we make sure they get the attention they deserve. On offense and defense, it's not just about how many points are scored or allowed, we focus on how effective, efficient, and explosive a team is. We evaluate their ability to move the ball, make critical stops, and create big plays. Whether it's marching down the field with precision or generating game-changing defensive stands, we look at the numbers that truly matter. This isn't just another top 25 list. It's a comprehensive, data-driven analysis that reflects the complexities and nuances of college football. So, buckle up as we dive into this week's rankings and break down the teams that are making waves.
And with that, good evening, everyone. Kenneth here, senior analyst for the Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network. And this podcast is going to be a little bit different. As we get ready to get the first release of the college football playoff top 25 on Tuesday, we kind of want to get out in front of that with our own playoff ranking style. So if you're watching this on YouTube or streaming it on Twitter, I want to say thank you. And also, if you're listening to it on your favorite podcast platform, I'm just going to read through what's on the screen here. What I have on the screen here is the playoff committee principles and what their mission is. So really quickly, the committee's task will be to select the best teams, rank those teams for inclusion in the playoffs, and then assign the teams to play to the playoff brackets and their game sites. Now, the principles: the committee will select teams using a process that distinguish among otherwise comparable teams by considering strength of schedule. And what they're really talking about is strength of record. So it's not just looking at your strength of schedule, but also comparing that to how your opponents have played. So that's really what they're talking about here. Another component is the head-to-head competition. So if that strength of schedule is pretty equal, one of the tiebreakers that will be considered is head-to-head matchups. comparative outcomes of common opponents without incentivizing the margin of victory. So, for example, Indiana beat Nebraska by a wide margin a few weeks ago. Ohio State, not so much. I think that game was a lot closer than what the Indiana was. It's not going to incentivize Indiana for beating Nebraska by a wider scale or penalize Ohio State for not beating that same common opponent by a much smaller number. Other relevant factors that will be factored in: the unavailability of key players and coaches. So last year we had both of these scenarios come up. Florida State loses their quarterback, Jordan Travis, with only a couple of games left in the season. That offense looked completely different with him not being there. Now, while Florida State continued to win, they clearly were not the same team when they lost Jordan Travis. Same thing can be said when Michigan had to suspend Jim Harbaugh not once but twice last year. You can see that team looked a lot different when Harbaugh wasn't on the sideline. So that was something that the playoff committee, when we only had 4 teams making the playoffs last season. Now we have 12. So without any further ado, I'm going to get into our top 25, starting from 25, working our way to number 1. And then I'm going to factor in some of the questions that I fully expect our listeners and followers are going to have. So let's get into the criteria here. And it kind of mimics what the committee laid out as far as what they're going to be looking at. So what we did was we put each team into a tier. And throughout the year, your tier can change based on how you're performing and then what has happened to teams that you've played. And we'll get into that a little bit more once we finish up the top 25. But you'll see that it just not merely stop at looking at the win-loss record for each team and slotting them accordingly. If you've been around college football since we've had the playoff committee for, I think, the last 10 plus years, you'll see that it's not just, well, who has the fewest losses, and that's how they're ranked 1 through 12. That's not how this process works, and that is not how the committee is going to have it to work. So let's jump into number 25. And checking in at number 25 is the Colorado Buffaloes. CU is having a fantastic season so far, and they're going to be rewarded for that really good season by continuing to move up the rankings. Now, Colorado was greatly benefited by what happened on Saturday with Iowa State and Kansas State both losing. That really put Colorado in a fantastic spot to potentially make it into the Big 12 title game. All right, so as I mentioned, Colorado sitting there, overall record of 6-2, but in a tie with Iowa State, as they both sit behind BYU in the conference. BYU in the Big 12, 5-0. Iowa State and Colorado sit with a 4-1 record. Coming in at number 24, the Vanderbilt Commodores. I call this team the scariest team in the Southeastern Conference right now. If Vanderbilt is on your schedule, watch out. You're going to be in for a dogfight. And this team, while they have 3 losses on their resume, folks, take a look at their opponents. The fact that Vandy is already bowl eligible is absolutely phenomenal. And this team right now sits basically tied in the conference with Ole Miss and Alabama. And if Vandy just runs out the schedule, this team is still got a couple of big time games left on their schedule. South Carolina going to LSU and playing Tennessee to close out the year. But what has really impressed as far as our strength of record rankings go is when you look at their schedule. An out of conference win against Virginia Tech, beating Alabama, narrowly losing to Texas, but that loss did not hurt their strength of record. So they have some really quality wins. And really, they're probably even better than their 7-3 record. So, I'm sorry, 6-3 record. So Vanderbilt just continue to fight. I would venture to bet that no one had Vanderbilt as high as they are right now. So that's a credit to their head coach Clark Lee and the fantastic job of Diego Pavia as far as what they've been able to get done thus far this season. Coming in at number 23. And this team is 8-0 on the season, and that is the Army Black Knights. Talked about this team all season long. Head coach Monken just done a fantastic job there. And sitting in a very, very good spot. They are the second highest ranked Group of 5 team right now, and you can venture to guess who's ahead of them. So if Army wins out, they're not guaranteed a playoff spot at the moment. Now, we know what's on Army's schedule coming up, and as I get ready to pull that up, Army has a date with Notre Dame coming up in 3 weeks, I'm sorry. So that is the most important game as far as being able to possibly leapfrog Boise State, because Boise is being benefited by a narrow loss to Oregon. If, and this is a big if Army can knock off Notre Dame, I'll be interested to see where the committee has them now. Army can't lose sight of the fact that they got to play at North Texas coming up this weekend. Got to take care of business, because any loss on that schedule will absolutely knock Army out of any contention of making the top 12. Checking in at number 22 off of a very difficult loss there, and that is the Kansas State Wildcats. K-State sits with a 7-2 record, and that loss to Houston will have ripple effects on Kansas State for the rest of the year. If you look at the Big 12 standings, which I'm currently looking at the moment, right now, as I mentioned, BYU sits at the top of the conference, 5-0. Iowa State, 5-1. Iowa State and Colorado, 4-1. K-State, Texas Tech, Cincinnati, Arizona State, and West Virginia all sit in the conference with 2 losses. And if you take a look at Kansas State's remaining schedule, they face off against Arizona State, Cincinnati, and Iowa State. That game, if they win the game against Arizona State, Cincinnati, it sets up a matchup with Iowa State potentially for the winner of that game to possibly go on and play in the Big 12 championship. So K-State, you're still in the mix for a automatic bid if you're able to win your conference, but you really cannot afford another loss in the regular season. It is truly March Madness time for you. It's win in advance, it's lose and go home. Checking in at number 21. And got to be honest, this one surprised me just a little bit. 6-3 out of the ACC, and that is the Louisville Cardinal. Now, Louisville coming off of a very impressive win on Saturday night against Clemson. They're on the road, winning that game 33-21. So, got a chance to watch a lot of that game. That game was really not even that close. Louisville dominated that game from pillar to post, and really it took a late score in the fourth quarter to really make that look a little bit more respectable. Looking at Louisville's remaining schedule at Stanford after their bye week this week, a game against Pitt, and then the game for the Commonwealth against Kentucky. That game is in Lexington this year. So Louisville, when we look at where you're sitting at in the conference, Miami and SMU sit at the top of the conference, both 5-0. Clemson 5-1. Clemson also has that second loss on their schedule and really no quality wins to show for it. Pitt sitting there at 3-1. You got Louisville sitting there at 4-2. So Louisville would need a lot of help getting into the ACC title game. Really would need a couple, probably would need a loss by either SMU or Miami in conference to really give them a chance to make the ACC title game. Checking in at number 20. And really, we don't have a conference home to really tie this team to, so we're going to call it the conference formerly known as the Pac-12, and that is the Washington State Cougars. Washington State 7-1 on the season. And when you look at Washington State, and I've talked about this on several appearances that I've had over the season, is there a chance where Washington State could make the college football playoffs? And I've said there is no chance that this team can make the college football playoffs. Yes, they do have a win over Washington, but that Washington Husky win is not going to be enough to really move the needle. They lost very convincingly to Boise State. And if you look at Wazoo's remaining schedule, games against Utah State, New Mexico, Oregon State, and Wyoming, with no conference championship game and really no conference affiliation to get in. So had they been a member of the Mountain West, they could have possibly set up a showcase showdown with Boise State for the winner to possibly get that automatic bid as the group of five highest rated champion. With not having that poker chip in their pocket, really don't see a chance of Washington State really moving above, let's say, spot 15 in either in our rankings or in the committee's rankings. Coming in at number 19, hotty toddy, everybody, and that is the Ole Miss Rebels. And as always, I'm going to give a quick hello to all of our Ole Miss friends, either watching or listening. Of course, all of our friends over at the Rebel Walk, they do a fantastic job of covering everything Ole Miss sports related. Can't thank them enough for all of their support. Also, Miss Patty, Miss Donna, Miss Kathy, and of course, Miss Ashley. Thank you, ladies, for always supporting us here at the Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network. All right, so Ole Miss. Let's talk about those Rebels here because we have some developments here. Ole Miss, with that win against Arkansas, they still sit with 2 conference losses. So getting to the Southeastern Conference title game, probably going to be difficult. Not impossible, but I will just say difficult. So let's take a look at Ole Miss's remaining schedule. Their biggest game on the schedule now. Ole Miss cannot afford a loss in any of these 3 games if they have any hopes of making the college football playoffs. But they have a date with the Georgia Bulldogs. They're in Oxford this coming Saturday. Folks, that game will be on the big show. It is one of our featured games of the week. And then they have to follow that up. Now, the benefit of that game against Georgia, if they're able to win it, they get a bye so they can kind of resettle themselves before going down to Gainesville. And then, of course, finishing up the year Thanksgiving weekend in the Egg Bowl against Mississippi State. So, Ole Miss, your task is clear. You've been in survival mode for the last 2 weeks now. You must run the table if you have any hopes of making the college football playoffs. Anything less, you'll be watching from the sidelines. Staying here right in the Southeastern Conference and off of a win that many of us are not surprised that took place, and that is the South Carolina Gamecocks. Folks, that line was set at 2.5 for a reason, and you never saw any bookmaker really move off of that number. South Carolina was always the right side, and man, did they absolutely dominate against Texas A&M. Beat the Aggies 44-20. And you're like, how is a 3-loss team sitting here kind of like Vanderbilt where they're rated extremely high? It is that strength of schedule. And when you look at some of the teams that they've played, LSU, now lost all 3 of these, so we have to factor that in. Was beat quite convincingly by Ole Miss, narrowly losing that game to Alabama, but it's where your 3 opponents currently sit as far as their rankings go. That is what's boosting up South Carolina right now. Getting that win over A&M was very significant. They have a very important date right here in my backyard against the Vanderbilt Commodores. I'm not saying South Carolina has any college football playoff aspirations with 3 losses. Don't see a 3-loss team from the Power 4 conferences getting in, but they can make it extremely difficult for some team to jump them by continuing to play well as they've played over the past couple of weeks. Checking in at number 17, it is our highest group of 5 team right now, and that is the Boise State Broncos. Boise State comes in with a very impressive record, 7-1. That one loss was against Oregon. And if you look at Boise State's schedule, it's starting to shape up to where if Boise State just takes care of business, they're probably going to face Colorado State, the Rams, in the Mountain West Championship game, as both of those teams sit with a 4-0 conference record. Now, let's take a look at what's on the docket left for Boise State, because there's still work to be done. They got Nevada coming up this weekend before going on the road to take on the Aztecs of San Jose State, followed by a trip to Laramie to face the Wyoming Cowboys, and then closing out the schedule at home against the Beavers of Oregon State. So more than likely, it's going to be Colorado State and Boise State for the Mountain West title game. Believe that game would be on the Smurf turf up there in Boise, as they would be the higher ranked team in that matchup. If for some reason Colorado State slips, we would likely get a rematch with UNLV and Boise State. So Boise, you can't afford any losses here, whether it's in the regular season or in the Mountain West Championship game. Coming up at number 16 is definitely going to throw you guys for a surprise. It was one of our surprises, but when we look at it, it kind of makes sense. So checking in at number 16 is the Texas Longhorns. Texas 7-1 on the season, 3-1 in the Southeastern Conference. and they're just percentage points behind Georgia and A&M that sit at the top of the conference with a 5-1 record. Tennessee sits there with a 4-1 record. LSU is 3-1. I mentioned the three-way tie with Ole Miss, Alabama, and Vanderbilt. This weekend in the Southeastern Conference is truly Elimination Saturday. I'll get to that here in just a moment. Let's get back to the Longhorns. Why is Texas so low as far as the strength of schedule rankings? When you look at who is the best win that Texas has right now, it's certainly not Michigan. It's definitely not Oklahoma. Their best win right now is over a 3-loss Vanderbilt team. Now, that's no disrespect to what Vandy has done this season, but when you're looking at Texas's record and their opponents, you can't find a better win than that at the moment. Because when you look at Michigan right now is not a game that you want to hang your hat on when the playoff committee comes around. Michigan is already a 4-loss team. And when you look at what's left on Michigan's schedule, a game against Indiana, Northwestern, and Ohio State, is not out of the realm of possibility that Michigan could be a 6-loss team this year. So that's something that you thought would have helped Texas at the beginning of the year is actually going to be a detriment for the Longhorns. So right now, that's why Texas sits as low as they are right now. Checking in at number 15, the SMU Mustangs. We talked about where they sit in the Atlantic Coast Conference, 8-1 record overall, 5-0 in conference. And if you look at what's left on the docket for SMU, folks, it's not a bad ride. They have to bye this weekend. They have a home game against Boston College in 2 weeks, followed by a trip up to Charlottesville to take on the Cavaliers of Virginia. And then they close out the season at home against the Cal Golden Bears. You could see SMU playing their way into the ACC championship game, likely against Miami, with a playoff spot definitely on the table for both teams. Checking in at number 14, and we just referenced this team and where they sit in conference, and that is the Cyclones of Iowa State. Iowa State coming off of a heartbreaking loss there to Texas Tech at home in Ames, losing that game 23-22. What's left on the docket for Iowa State? Well, this weekend they have a road game against the Kansas Jayhawks, followed by a home game against Cincinnati, on the road at Utah, and then we talked about that showcase showdown with Kansas State. Iowa State needs to run the table in these next 3 games for that game against Kansas State to be for a berth into the Big 12 title game. So Iowa State, a lot of work to do left, and really can't afford any slip-ups here in the next couple of weeks of the season. Checking in at number 13, and the only way that this team can get in is to get one of those wild card berths, as we're going to call it, and that is the Notre Dame Fighting Irish, checking in at number 13. And one of the biggest losers this weekend was Notre Dame. And I'm going to explain to you why that is the case. What was helping out Notre Dame was Navy with just 1 loss. Well, Navy now has 2 losses. So that's going to knock that win down just a little bit. And then Texas A&M now having also 2 losses, it is knocking Notre Dame down a little bit. So when those rankings come out on Tuesday, don't expect Notre Dame to be in like the top 8 or 9. I think that they may be around where we have them sitting here at 13. And when you look at Notre Dame's schedule, that win, if they are able to get it this weekend against Florida State, will not be a positive. Now, the one thing they can't do is lose to a 7-loss Florida State team. So take care of business fighting Irish. But when you look at the remaining part of their schedule, after this weekend, they play Virginia in a couple of weeks. We talked about that neutral site game against Army, and then they close out the season against the USC Trojans. Folks, I talk about Michigan not being a positive factor for Texas. SC may be it's possible that SC could be a 6-loss team as well. So that game is not going to provide a lot of benefits for Notre Dame, assuming that they win out. So Notre Dame is going to need some help as far as their strength of schedule goes to get bumped up, but they need absolutely for Army to remain undefeated if they have any real shot of getting one of those playoff slots. Checking in at number 12 is the Pitt Panthers. We already talked about where this team sits in the Atlantic Coast Conference, basically in a tie for third with Clemson. And when we look at Pitt's remaining schedule, Pitt's has coming up this weekend a home game against Virginia, then a home game against Clemson. Absolutely have to win that ball game. 1, to jump Clemson in the standings, and then 2, put themselves in position in case, and they would really need Miami to stumble and lose, because they would actually need SMU, since they just lost to SMU. They would need SMU to lose 2 conference games to get into the ACC title game. So Pitt is going to need a lot of favors called in if they're going to get to the ACC title game. Checking in at number 11, and this is still America's team, and that is the Indiana Hoosiers. Biggest winner on Saturday was the Indiana Hoosiers, not only because they ran their record to 9-0 overall, but also 6-0 in the conference in a tie with Oregon at the top of the standings. But that loss by Penn State, very significant for Indiana, because had Ohio State lost that ball game, you would have seen Indiana's strength of schedule drop just a little bit more, because now you'd be facing a 2-loss Ohio State team instead of a 1-loss Ohio State team. And with that win for Ohio State, that gives them a top 5, top 10 win. That is actually going to help out Indiana, because really, when you look at their season so far, it's really hard to find who their best win is against right now. It's sad to say, but their best win may be against a Nebraska Cornhusker team that is, to say, not very good. So what's left for America's team in the remaining 3 games on the season? This weekend, they have Michigan coming into Bloomington, followed by a bye week, and then that big game against Ohio State. That game literally could come down to the winner of that contest will go on to likely face Oregon in the Big Ten championship game there in Indianapolis at the end of the year. Then they close out the season with a game against in-state rival, the Boilermakers of Purdue. So, Indiana, your path is clear now. All you have to do is beat Michigan and Ohio State and Purdue. You'll go to the Big Ten title game and virtually guaranteeing yourself a playoff spot. A loss against Ohio State, considering that you already sit at 11, that puts you on the cut line right now. So you really got to make sure that you take care of business this weekend against Michigan and set up that date with the Buckeyes of Ohio State. One of the biggest losers, I talked about it, staying right there in the Big Ten, is the Penn State Nittany Lions. And Penn State should not feel comfortable about their playoff bid there. Right now, they sit in a tie, but basically they're behind Ohio State. So we're going to say that they're in the 4th spot in the Big Ten standings right now. Half a game ahead of Iowa and Minnesota. 7-1 on the season, 4-1 in conference. But let's take a look at Penn State's schedule. Who is the best win for Penn State so far? Folks, it would be a unranked Illinois Fighting Illini team. That's their best win right now. This team absolutely needed that win yesterday against Ohio State to really give their strength of schedule some beef behind it, because when you look at what's coming up ahead, they have a home game against Washington. I believe that's going to be their whiteout game. Ooh. Followed by a road trip, back-to-back weekends against Purdue and Minnesota before ending the year against Maryland at home. Not a lot of beef on that schedule. I think I think Penn State is going to need some help to get into the college football playoffs, because when we get down to those final 2 or 3 slots, it's going to not just be what your record is, but who stands out. Who did you beat? Who did you play? And right now, Penn State is not going to get the benefit of the doubt on either one of those scenarios. One of the biggest losers right now, you would have to say the Aggies of Texas A&M. This team absolutely controlled their destiny as far as getting to the SEC title game for the first time since joining the conference. Now they've put themselves in a position to where they're still right there, basically in a tie for first with Georgia. We've already talked about who sits right behind them. Let's take a look at A&M's schedule right now. 2 losses on the schedule against Notre Dame and against South Carolina. Their best win right now is against LSU, and they absolutely need LSU to beat Alabama this weekend. So what's remaining for A&M? Well, they have to bye week this weekend, then a home date where they go out of conference to New Mexico State, a road trip to the Plains taking on the Auburn Tigers, and then the renewal of one of the best rivalries in all of college football on Thanksgiving weekend when they welcome in to Kyle Field the Texas Longhorns. They absolutely need Texas to come in to that ball game with just 1 loss as well. So there's still work to be done for the Texas A&M Aggies to get to Atlanta for the first time in school's history since they've joined the Southeastern Conference. Checking in at number 8 is the LSU Tigers. We've already covered where they stand as far as the conference goes. 6-2 record, 3-1 in conference. We've already talked about the Showcase Showdown, the elimination match against the Alabama Crimson Tide. This is truly a loser leave town match. The loser with 3 losses on the schedule has no shot of getting to the SEC title game, and I don't think have much of a chance of getting to the college football playoffs. Cannot see a 3-loss team making the college football playoffs this year. So it is truly win or or you're done. Followed by that game against Alabama, a road trip to Gainesville to take on the Gators, a home game against the Vanderbilt Commodores. Whew, whoever thought that that would be a big game at the beginning of the year, and then closing out the regular season schedule against the Sooners of Oklahoma. So LSU, and pretty much this is going to be the standard for a lot of teams right now. It's win and advance. If you lose, you're likely out at this point. Checking in at number 7, and this is going to raise a few eyebrows, but there's some merit for why Ohio State is number 7 and not a little bit higher. We've already talked about where they are in the standings, in a top. Well, not in a tie. They're third as far as the Big Ten. So why is Ohio State 7th when likely the committee is going to have them probably in the top 4? When you look at the Buckeyes' schedule, yes, they're being helped with that win over Penn State, and that is a very quality win. Outside of that, Ohio State's strength of schedule in the non-conference is a big bugaboo. Playing Akron, Western Michigan, and Marshall to open the season. Ohio State should have found a big-time Power 4 conference opponent to put into that slot right there. They could have easily played a Big 12 team, an ACC team, and really strengthen that strength of schedule a little bit better. Now, Ohio State, we know what your task is, and let's look at your schedule. The game this weekend against Purdue, followed by a road game against Northwestern, a home game against Indiana, and then closing out the season with Michigan. That Michigan win, if they get it this year, will absolutely not benefit Ohio State whatsoever as far as that strength of schedule goes. We already talked about Michigan possibly being a 6-loss team this year. That is not going to benefit Ohio State. They need Indiana to remain undefeated, and they need Penn State to run the table to really give them a stronger strength of schedule, because that non-conference is definitely not something that's going to impress this playoff committee. Checking in at number 6, out of the Southeastern Conference, the Alabama Crimson Tide. We've already talked about where Alabama sits as far as that log jam in the Southeastern Conference. And man, is it a log jam. It's elimination weekend. We've already talked about who their opponent is coming up. That trip down to Baton Rouge. Alabama, your task is clear. You have to win out. You step out of conference the following week versus Mercer before that road trip to Norman, Oklahoma to face the Sooners, and then closing out the regular season schedule with the Iron Bowl there in Tuscaloosa. Alabama, you cannot afford a single loss in those last 4 games. If you win out, you now have an opportunity to get into the college football playoffs with just 2 losses, but having a strong strength of schedule will absolutely benefit you. When you think about that game against Vandy, many people would have thought that would have been a crutch. It's actually a blessing right now. But stepping out of conference and playing Wisconsin absolutely benefits Alabama. Getting that win over Georgia also benefits. So Alabama 4-0 to close out the season to make the college football playoffs. All right, checking in at number 5. Out of the Big 12 is the 8-0 BYU Cougars. We've already covered the standings. BYU, your remaining schedule. Rivalry game. It's still called the Holy War, and that is coming up Saturday night in prime time. Matter of fact, we're going to call it a little Big 12 after dark against Utah, followed by a home game against Kansas. That trap game against Arizona State there in the desert could be something to watch out for against Arizona State. And then closing out the schedule on Thanksgiving weekend against the Houston Cougars. We just saw Houston pull off a big upset this past weekend. BYU, do not take that game for granted. If you run the table, you are in the Big 12 title game with a chance to go to the college football playoff. So run the table and make it extremely difficult for the committee to leave you out. That win over SMU in the non-conference, getting that win over K-State, also very significant for your strength of schedule. So as long as those two teams continue to win out, that's only going to benefit BYU to close out the schedule. Checking in at number 4, Rocky Top, the Tennessee Volunteers, 7-1 on the season. We've already talked about the log jam in the SEC. No need to rehash that. So let's take a look at what is remaining for the Volunteers. They have a home game against Mississippi State this weekend, followed by a very important game in Athens against the Georgia Bulldogs. Stepping out of conference to take on UTEP, University of Texas, El Paso, and then closing out the schedule against Vanderbilt. That game against Georgia is going to be very significant. I think even though we have Tennessee rated extremely high, that non-conference could be a liability as well for Tennessee. They need Alabama to win out. I think they need to get that win over Georgia, and they need Vandy to possibly win out to give them another quality win. So Tennessee, your path is clear. If you're able to run the table these last couple of weeks, 4-0, I think Tennessee can make the college football playoff. Checking in at number 3, out of the Atlantic Coast Conference, the Hurricanes of Miami. 9-0 on the season, 5-0 in conference. When we look at what's left for Miami, a road trip up to Atlanta to take on the Yellow Jackets of Georgia Tech, a bye week, followed by a game against Wake Forest. The game's going to be in Winston-Salem. And then closing out the schedule with longtime rival dating back to their Big East days. They make the trip up to the Carrier Dome, because that's still what it is to me. I don't know what they call it now, but it's still a Carrier Dome. That's the Orange Men of Syracuse. That game could be very important for the Miami Hurricanes, because when you look at Miami's schedule, their best win right now would be over Louisville. So Miami, run the table, get into the ACC title game as an undefeated team. You give the committee something to think about, even if you lost that ACC title game. A one-loss Miami in a Power 4 conference would be very difficult to leave out. Checking in at number 2, quack, quack, the Oregon Ducks. Oregon sits with also a 9-0 record, 6-0 in the Big Ten, in a tie with Indiana for the conference. We know their biggest win coming at home over Ohio State. Also, what's really helping Oregon is Boise State. That win over Boise State all the way back in week 2. Still very significant there for the Ducks. And folks, I can make a very strong case that Oregon could have been the number 1 team. When we get to the breakdown, I'll tell you why they're number 2 for us. Oregon's remaining schedule, they have Maryland this weekend, followed by a trip to Madison, Wisconsin to take on the Badgers. before closing it out with a bye week and then playing a longtime conference foe back in their Pac-12 days, the Washington Huskies. So Oregon, take care of business these last 3 games. You'll find your way into the Big Ten title game as your first year in the Big Ten playing for that championship. Very significant there. And folks, the number 1 team in our committee rankings will be the Georgia Bulldogs. Fresh off of their rivalry win against the Florida Gators, we find that the Georgia Bulldogs 7-1 on the season, 5-1 in conference. We know that one loss coming on the road to Alabama, where they absolutely stunk up the first half, battled their way back. So when we look at Georgia's strength of schedule, and this is what's really benefiting this team, that week 1 game against Clemson. Yes, Clemson has 2 losses right now, but still a very quality opponent. When we look at in conference, that loss against Alabama, but then absolutely dominating on the road against Texas, absolutely benefiting the Georgia Bulldogs. And when you look at what Georgia has left, we've already talked about that big time matchup there in Oxford, going to the Grove to face Ole Miss this Saturday afternoon, then followed by another big time matchup against Tennessee. That game is in Athens. They'll step out of conference to take on UMass before ending their season at home against Georgia Tech. I think if Georgia goes 3-1, regardless of who that loss may come to, I think even a 2-loss Georgia Bulldogs team still makes the college football playoffs. But if you're talking about wanting to secure that first round bye, I think if this team runs the table, gets into the SEC title game, wins it, they'll be one of those top 4 seeds on the final selection Sunday by the playoff committee. So that is our top 25 playoff rankings. And let's get to a couple of questions before we close out here. So I've already talked about why Georgia is ahead of an undefeated Oregon. It is that massive strength of schedule, not only when you look at who Georgia has played, but who Georgia has upcoming. When you look at playing a Tennessee, Ole Miss, Texas, Alabama, and Clemson all on your schedule, that really beefs up that resume for the Georgia Bulldogs, and would not be surprised on Tuesday night if the committee does not see it the same way as we do. Worst case scenario, you're looking at Georgia being the number 2 team in the country on Tuesday. Like I said, I think that their quality of wins and that strength of schedule makes it hard to bypass Georgia over any other team in the country right now. Another question that came up when the team and I were talking was, why is Alabama ahead of Ohio State, despite Alabama having 2 losses and Ohio State just picking up that big time win on the road against Penn State? And again, it comes back to the strength of schedule. When you look at Ohio State's non-conference and you look at Alabama's, it is just a little bit different. And despite having that second loss, still Alabama's quality of opponents is just a tick better than Ohio State. And we have them separated literally by half a point. So you're not talking about a big margin there between Alabama and Ohio State. It's literally half a point difference. If Alabama wins against LSU, you may see that margin increase by a little bit. But if Alabama happens to lose this weekend against LSU, you could see LSU jump ahead of Ohio State in our rankings, because LSU sits 1/10 of a point behind Ohio State. So the strength of the SEC is really working in their favor. We talked about the Big Ten really being top heavy. Once you get past Penn State at 4, it is a major drop off. When you look at the Southeastern Conference overall standings, you're looking at quality opponents from 1 really all the way down to South Carolina, which is basically in 9th place right now, and they're coming off of a complete throttling of Texas A&M. So the strength 1 through 9 of the Southeastern Conference is much better than the Big Ten. So that's where the SEC is really just head and shoulders above the Big Ten. It's once you get past that top 4. And what was the biggest surprise for me in this playoff style ranking instead of our usual top 25? I would say Texas being as low as they are. I fully expect Texas to be probably in the top 10 on Tuesday night, but I would say Texas being at 15 was a very big surprise. Another surprise would be, and we kind of talked about it, I'm actually a little bit surprised that Notre Dame isn't a little bit further down. I would have thought that SMU and Texas would have been ahead of Notre Dame. So, and when we look at it, SMU is 0.3 of a point behind Notre Dame. So that's not quite significant, but there is a major gap between SMU and Texas. You're looking at almost a full point difference. So that is something that has definitely surprised me in this first release of our playoff committee top 25. As we get ready to wrap up on this beautiful Sunday night, we got the NFL finishing up before Sunday night football. Want to say thank you all for either watching on YouTube, subscribing, or streaming us on Twitter, and catching us on your favorite podcast platform. On behalf of my fantastic team, as we get ready for the big show on Wednesday, breaking down 5 big-time matchups this weekend in college football. For Jessica, for Summer, our 2 talented co-hosts, Billy, our senior handicapping analyst. This is Kenneth, founder and senior analyst for the Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network. Want to say thank you. Have a great rest of your Sunday night. Tuesday is going to be very interesting as far as the playoff committee releases their first rankings. Have a great rest of your Sunday. And as always, God bless everybody.